Coming up to 2 years ago now saw the release of my animated series, The Dragon Ravine. A few people have asked me to make a behind the scenes video, and finally, here that video is. Storytelling, especially in films and video games, has had a huge impact on my life. Fantasy and science fiction have always been my favourite genres, my first exposure to stories like Star Wars and Dragonheart being before I can remember. In addition, I've always had a huge creative spark in my nature, so beyond telling you my inspirations, I can't really explain why I decided to make The Dragon Ravine. It's just something I've always wanted to do. Fully going over how the story came together would honestly demand a video of its own, but the core idea for the plot actually came from a Yu-Gi-Oh card that's literally called Dragon Ravine. I remember looking at it and thinking, that sounds cool, that could be the name of a film or something, and so I thought of a story that centered around trying to find this legendary place. The history of the dragons stemmed from there, with a lot of important world-building details being heavily inspired by Hollow Knight, which I was playing at the time. The original idea for the Maras was that they would lose their minds outside of the realm of the Empire, mirroring what happened to Quirrell when he was away from Hallownest. And the idea for the Emperor mostly came from the Pale King, because I love the whole idea of a monarch who's more than human, like a divine ruler whom no one even considers rebelling against, regarded with the kind of reverence you'd expect for a god. The ravine itself I put underground so that mining could be a big part of the show, just as it is in Poldark. I'll save you from listing where all the ideas came from, but by the summer of 2022 I had a pretty good idea of what the story was going to be and began drawing. The final draft of the script wasn't actually finished until November of that year, at which point I asked several friends if they'd lent their beautiful voices to the project. They were all friends I'd acted with or had seen acting in amateur theatre productions, and I was very excited to have them on board. Recording everyone's performances was fairly simple. I would just call all of the cast members individually, and we'd read through the script together, I would give notes, and we'd discuss characters in quite a lot of depth. Then we'd practice the scenes a few times, and that was that. I'd leave it up to them to record their lines in their own time, because everything else takes so long there wasn't really much of a rush for this stage. I did ask them to record every line 3 times, so when I came around to editing I had a few different takes to choose from, and that allowed me to construct the dialogue in a way that sounded natural, as if the actors were all in the same room, despite the fact that everyone was just doing this on their own, sending me recordings of their line readings. Drawing was by far the longest part of the process. I started by reading back through the script and effectively storyboarding, planning out all of the backdrops I'll need for each scene in my little notebook. I'll write descriptions as well as drawing sprites I might need to make sure the sketches are easy to understand when I come back to them later. Making the backdrops was fairly simple after this, because I'd basically just follow the guide that's in my notebook. I start with a pencil sketch, which takes a lot of trial and error, but once it looks good to me, I'll colour it in, and then finally trace over the outline in pen and add some shading with a standard pencil to finish. Sprites are a little bit more challenging, but it's normally quite clear what I need to draw just from what the backdrops look like. In a way, I've basically already decided how the shots will be framed, so I just need to draw sprites that fit in. For that reason, I often drew them beside the backdrops that they'd appear in, but obviously in the case of characters, they appear in many different scenes, and so for each character I drew what I called a sprite chart, which was just the keyframes of their walking animations in 4 directions, as well as any other common actions they might do, like Dago drawing his sword or Magnus knocking an arrow. I had to finish the drawing stage entirely before moving on to animation, except for the intro, which I drew with a stylus and a tablet. But because I drew everything else on paper, I had to take photos, then remove the backgrounds for all the sprites, before I could do any animating. That meant that in order to have consistent lighting, I had to take all of the photos on the same day. I know I didn't have to use daylight, but using torches or even just having the flash on led to flares, and a lot of room lights are yellow, which would have tinted the colour palette of the whole show, which I didn't want. But once they were all software ready, the fun could begin. I used Flipperclip, which is a 2D animation software app for mobile devices. The basic setup I use is a 1080p canvas, 12 frames per second, and a minimum of 5 layers. The bottom layer is always reserved for the backdrop, and the top one is usually where I put faces or other effects that I draw within the app. Some scenes have things that need to go above the foreground, and obviously some scenes have a lot more moving objects in them than others, but I can normally get away with my usual 5 layers. My process is to rush through every action that happens in an episode without a care for timing or dialogue. These sort of quick, rough cuts, or maybe I should call them rush cuts, are the difficult parts of animating, and it's what I use for trailers. If you look at the way Harpy moves in this shot in the trailer, see how there's no breathing room between him taking the rock, inspecting it, looking up, and then moving away. Whereas in the finished episode, he talks between a lot of these actions. I just animate everything that moves to begin with, and then go back in later to sort out timing and talking. Speaking of which, FlipperClip has an audio feature which I use for the dialogue. I import everyone's voice recordings into the different channels, then trim and edit them here into a full flowing conversation. That is until I get to a point where an action will happen on screen that I can't predict the timing for. At that point, I'll go back and copy and paste frames until I have the visuals for the whole scene of dialogue. Eventually, I'll have the full runtime with everything paced as it should be, only now I need to go back one final time and animate the talking. This bit is quite tedious, but also very easy, because FlipperClip plays the little sample of audio that goes with each frame as you scroll through them, so I can tell on each individual frame what kind of sound the speaker is making, and then just copy and paste my simple drawings of wide mouth, closed mouth, or the O-shaped one as required. It's very simple, and I got the technique from watching the Big Lez Show at 0.5 times speed and really focusing on how the talking was done. In the same way, I also got it from Big Lez to fade between key frames instead of drawing loads of additional sprites. It's very crude and lazy, but it works way better than it feels like it should. And then for quicker actions, I use the squash and stretch technique to both anticipate them and, again, to get away with as few drawings as possible. The best example for this is Dago drawing his sword, which consists of only 3 paper drawings, but I squash the first sprite for a few frames before changing to the second, then stretch the second to show he's pulling on the handle, and the final sprite is stretched when it first appears, and takes a few frames to settle into its normal proportions. Finally, I digitally drew a little slashing effect to help show how the sword got to where it is now, and the overall result looks pretty smooth, I think. FlipperClip has some customization options when it comes to onion skins, and I normally had it show both the frame before and after, each distinguished with colours, red being before and green being after. I bring this up because when animating characters talking, if I were looking at a frame where their mouth is closed, but in the previous frame it was open, it would look like they have lipstick on, which I found very funny. But anyway, once all the talking is finally animated, there's one more very important step before we move on to post-production, and that is proof watching. You would not believe the amount of continuity errors, accidental splodges, and all manner of other mistakes I found when watching it back. It seriously helps to check your work as you go, and this applies to every stage of production, not just the animating. It is not fun to have to redact assets that took time and effort to make. But once I've watched the whole thing a couple of times and I'm happy with it, I press export. Now I have a video file of the full cut of an episode, already with the dialogue audio all mixed and in the right place, so the only things left to do are to add other sound effects and music, and then tack on the intro and the credits, and the episode will be ready. Making the music is one of my favourite parts of the whole process. I listen to a lot of soundtracks of films and games, and I'm really excited that I'm now making my own. If you want a quick list of favourites, my go-to is the first Hunger Games film. I think James Newton Howard composed a masterpiece of a soundtrack for that. Doctor Who, especially series 1 through 4, have some really good tracks. Titan Souls, a little boss rush game, that's got a great OST. Zelda, obviously, the Ori games. Dune, A Short Hike. Oh my, Studio Ghibli has some great music. There's too many. What I do is use an app on my phone that works in much the same way as GarageBand, if you've ever used that, where you just arrange MIDI tracks. There's a whole load of different instrument sounds you can choose from. Some of them are better than others, and obviously none of them are as good as getting actual players to perform, but it's about the best I can do just on my own. I suppose I could have made it minimal, performing solos for the soundtrack, kind of like what Jared Wright did with his guitar for making the Big Lez Show. But then I'd be limited to the instruments I can play, so I wouldn't have had drums, orchestral strings, and especially woodwind, which a lot of the tracks are built around. Little trivia for you, Dago can play the flute. That's something that through redrafting the story over and over, eventually just didn't make it into the show, but that was the original reason why the flute plays a lot of the melodies in the soundtrack. The main benefit of the Music Studio app being on my phone is that I can work on it pretty much anywhere, on a bus or train or just anywhere out and about. As long as I've got headphones with me, I can work on my music, which is probably the reason why I usually finish it way in advance of any other stage of production. It's funny then that I only need it right at the end during the very last stage in the video editor. That is probably the most satisfying stage of production because it's far quicker than drawing and animating, and when it's done, there's no more work left to do. I have a finished episode at that point, and it's really satisfying to see the final product of all the work I've put in over such a long time. So that was just about all the work that went into making the first series. From its inception in February 2022, it took just over 2 years to complete. I drew 413 unique drawings in total for the project, although not all of them made it into the finished product, and it took nearly 36,000 individual frames of animation across the series as a whole. It is by far the most ambitious project I've ever taken on in my life, and that isn't likely to change, especially considering that the story is far from over. Writing Series 2 ended up being quite the challenge. I always knew vaguely where I wanted the story to go, but compared to Series 1, which was quite secluded and set in faraway places, what happens in Series 2 much more overtly sets up later events, so I had to think very far ahead and put in a lot of work to iron out all the kinks that showed up. I really wanted to make sure that everything progressed naturally, and that just took time. On top of that, I wanted a little break after working on this one project for over 2 years. Especially when I came up with the idea for what would eventually be The Hand of Amelia Khan. I got very passionate about it and poured basically everything into that before coming back to anything else. Hopefully that explains the long wait between Series 1 and 2, but to update you on where I'm at, as of right now the new script is finished, and I've already got people down to voice the new characters that are going to appear. Drawing has begun and shouldn't take as long as last time because a lot of them can be reused from the previous series. I can't make a promise for when it'll be out because this isn't my job, I do all of this in my spare time, but I am hoping for early next year, so it is moving again, which is very exciting. Of course, there will be videos in between. I haven't forgotten about World of Water, and there's a couple of other video ideas I'm thinking about, so thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you later.